Hello, everyone. Nice to have you here. I'm Ornaldo Gjergji. I work for the European Data Journalists Network, and we wanted to organize within this conference a panel about sustainable journalism. And for this, we decided to invite Lars Tallert, who is Senior Advisor at the FOIO Media Institute and the Linnaeus University, Sweden representative to the UNESCO IPDC Intergovernmental Council, Policy Advisor to the Global Forum for Media Development, and last but not least, the founding president of the Sustainable Journalist Partnership. And so I would start from the last thing to ask you if you can help us define what sustainable journalism is. What do we mean by sustainable journalism?
Thank you. And I think we have had some discussions about sustainability models. And I think that maybe the media industry is the only industry in the world that still defines sustainability as connected to economic growth, what I would call financial viability. So actually, the way we define sustainable journalism is in a broader context. A couple of years ago, some media researchers, editors-in-chiefs, media developers from mainly the Nordic countries and sub-Saharan Africa, we met and we asked ourselves two questions. How can journalism contribute to a sustainable society better? And how can media in itself be more sustainable, environmentally, socially, and economically? So we tend to focus our discussions very much on the economic sustainability, which is of course necessary. But we cannot ignore social and environmental sustainability. And this is the essence of what we call sustainable journalism. So it's a holistic concept, where we first look at content, that is our product, news. So we need to produce and publish content that contributes to sustainable society and at the same time generate revenues for the media. So even though we might think that the situation is gloomy already as it is, we definitely need to think about environmental and social sustainability. We need to have sustainable business models that takes into account environment, climate change. We need to have environmentally sustainable production and distribution. And not least, we need innovative, gender-balanced and inclusive newsrooms and organizations. This is not rocket science, but this is what we don't see happening in most media organizations. To make this possible, we need research on the connection between journalism and sustainability, and we need education on sustainable journalism. So this is what we discussed, and we said, how do we put this in action? Well, we decided to make a global NGO that is called the Sustainable Journalism Partnership, a community where we could discuss these questions. We did that about 1 year ago. Today, we are about 400 researchers and media leaders, senior reporters from 67 countries that are trying to find answers to these questions. So, this is in brief, sustainable journalism and what we have made out of it, which is the Sustainable Journalism Partnership, a community where we discuss these issues.
Thank you. And of course, within sustainable journalism, climate journalism plays a big role. And in deciding the title for this panel, you chose a pretty provocative title, in my opinion. Is climate journalism digging the grave for the media? What do you mean by that? Can you build up on that? And how do you think we could do better climate journalism to make it more sustainable?
Most of all, I thought it was like 4:30, last day of the conference, so I thought I needed a provocative title for this. But there is quite a lot of truth to that. And I think that, just to give you one example, because when we, in this community, we want to give practical advice. And I will give you, on climate journalism, I will give you a 5-minute crash course that is a summary of a 2-day workshop, so you understand a few things of what we are doing. And when I talk about this, and I will do it very fast now, I'm just stating the obvious. But the thing is, if you look at how climate journalism is being done, I mean, I think all of you are professional journalists, so this is just plain good journalism. But if we look at what is happening specifically on climate journalism, it's like we've forgotten everything we have learned about journalism and we do other things. Obviously, we have to make stories that are of concern to your audiences. A child can understand that. I'll give you one good example from Nation Media in Kenya. They did a story, a number of stories on what kind of crops are resilient to climate change. Huge success, huge economic success, and also a huge success if we want to improve the sustainability of the society. This is example. This is very far from COP27 and COP28 or whatever COP it is. This is what people are concerned about. Second, stating the obvious again, facts alone don't help. And when it comes to climate journalism, we are kind of obsessed with 1.6 degrees and 1.7 degrees, and that is very, very difficult to communicate. We are storytellers. Good journalism is about doing compelling stories, and we seem to have forgotten that when it comes to climate journalism. Third lesson, don't focus on the doom and gloom, but talk about the benefits of engagement and change. And we see, if you read the Reuters Digital News report, you see that news avoidance is a big problem and is very much connected to climate journalism, to issues that are under dispute. And climate is, of course, one of them. So not talking about the benefits and engagement means that we lose subscribers and we also lose engaged citizens. So we need to rethink and say, yes, of course, we need to report about the bad things, but also remember to report about the benefits and engagement of change. And this is connected to that. Make stories that provide spaces where people creatively find empowerment. Our role as journalists is to empower people, right? What we tend to do is that we make people in despair. And that is a new problem. I've been doing journalism for 40 years. In the 80s, that was not a problem. But in the present digital media landscape where we navigate, that is contaminated by disinformation, by populist politicians, and threats, harassment, we need to be more strategic. I speak to the managers, the media managers that are here. Don't isolate climate journalism from the rest of the newsroom. I've seen so many examples where you have, I ask, how do you work with climate journalism? And I say, yeah, that's the climate guy sitting over there. And you see some strange guy sitting in the corner. You need to integrate climate journalism into the newsroom. There's not one size fits all model, but integration of climate journalism is absolute. Don't make a climate silo. And that is also very, very true for reporting. We tend to write about climate as if it's something that is happening outside reality. Make climate impact part of all beats. Fashion, celebrities, sports, everything is related to climate. But if we separate climate journalism into some kind of political silo for people that are already kind of interested in the topic, then we will lose audiences and we will lose engaged citizens. The messenger is often more important than the message. I tell you one really interesting study in the US where they studied conservative audiences in the US. And they wanted to find out who was the most effective messenger if you want to report climate news to conservative audiences in the US. The answer was quite surprising. High-ranking militaries. So next time you do a story on climate journalism, why don't you interview a high-ranking military? This is the way we need to rethink, you know. Basic climate literacy is a must, of course. And there's a lot of things happening on that. That's a positive news that I bring to you. There's a lot of newsrooms that are taking this seriously. So things are finally starting to move, about 30 years too late, but it's a lot of things happening now, and that's the positive thing. Formats need to fit your targeted audiences. There is no mass audience. There hasn't been a mass audience for 20 years. So we can't go on pretending that there is a mass audience. If we look, I'm engaged in a very interesting study now together with Professor Christopher Holt at my university. How do young people, aged 18 to 25, define quality news? How do they define news? Well, it's not connected to how I would define it, but it's the event itself. Everything that is out there is news, and journalism is reporting about the news. So there are about 5 billion other people reporting about the news. So that's also put us in a different situation. Do stories that seek to find common grounds through human stories. Polarization is one of the main problems, I think, in all the countries. I'm from Sweden. Polarization is terrible. I was in Finland 2 days ago. Same problem. I think here in Greece, the same. We see it everywhere, everywhere. When it comes to climate change, we need to solve this together. So that is a common ground, and I think that is an important message when we do journalism. Do stories that focus on the here and now, rather what is likely to happen in a distant future. Here we see definitely an improvement, but on the other hand, it's mostly stories about forest fires, about floodings, about disasters, where we as citizens are portrayed as victims. And we are not portraying all the heroes that are actually doing fantastic things to prevent climate change. Yeah. Crash course in climate journalism in 5 minutes. If you want the 2-day workshop, you're most welcome to connect with me.
Thank you, Lars. And we talked about the storytelling, the writing, the stories, and how we should do that. But of course, journalism is not just about reporting. There is an entire business. So there is the production, the distribution, and all the development of the stories. And there might be, that probably will be, regulation on every different sector about the, let's say, acceptable amount of carbon footprint to do some activities, and these might also arrive for the media sector. And so what do you think about it? But especially, how could that be an issue for maybe small and medium news outlets which don't have the resources that maybe big media outlets can have in order to adapt to this kind of regulation? And how do you think the media landscape will be transformed in case this regulation will take place?
That is a very important question. And it also, the answer to that is, once again, business and the way we report are interrelated, because there will be regulation based on your carbon footprint. That is certain, especially in the EU. I will give it 2 or 3 years until all media companies are obliged to present your carbon footprint. So you need to set up a system for that. And I think for the big media companies, it's not they can do it. But if I look at the small media companies, all the promising startups, the media companies that really make a change, as I see it, that would be very, very difficult. So we need to come together and do this jointly as an industry. And I can tell that Finland, go to Finland and ask what they are doing, because they have been working on this for several years. And a couple of weeks ago, the Danish publishers also agreed, together with the advertisers, to set up a system where you account for your carbon footprint. And of course, this is very good. This is a good thing for society, but it's also necessary, because if you don't do it, you will be out of business. So it's not only something we should do, it's something we have to do if we want to stay in business. And I'm particularly worried about the small media companies. We really need to assist them as much as we can, because setting up a system is very similar regardless if you're a big company or a small media company. So this is a challenge that we need to take on.
Thank you. And before opening for questions from the public, I would like to make one personal one, which is, do you see that there is like some generational struggles when covering climate or in sustainable journalism? I remember when we were preparing this talk, you told me about new master's degrees in sustainable journalism, like sustainability becoming something for journalism itself. But of course, this might take time. And how do you see this developing?
Well, first of all, I'm worried that we talk about sustainability as only making long-term profit. That is very worrying, and I think we need to stop doing that. We need to talk about, like they do in every other sector, sustainability is economical sustainability, environmental and social sustainability, and these three dimensions are intertwined. That's the one thing. The other answer is, well, my generation, we screwed up the earth, sorry for that. Your generation needs to fix it, and we need, and we can. I'm happy to assist as much as we can, but I see both when it comes to climate reporting and when it comes to the interest or the lack of interest among media managers for the entire climate change issue, I'm worried. We really need to step up. Media sector is far behind most other sectors. I have connection, for instance, with forest sector, the steel sector. They are incredibly advanced. Why are we journalists? We should explain the world to the rest of the people. Why are we lagging behind when it comes to sustainability thinking? That is what I would like to ask you.
Thank you, Lars. And if from the public there's any question, now is the time.
Hi, my name is Clara. I lead a fact-checking organization in Spain. And we have a climate section that I think has done some things right, and many others clearly not. But one of the things that we've seen over time in Spain, which is a country that has very little interest in climate reporting, even though we have a huge climate change issue, and we are very heavily affected by climate change, what we see is that there's very little climate literacy. So what we are doing from the fact-checking perspective is a lot of pre-banking stories and explanatory articles trying to get through people, but we often find that things get very technical at some level, especially when we're talking about regulation and discussions within Parliament. I'm wondering, what is your 2 cents for that kind of situation on how to get over it and try to attract more public, because in Spain it's a real problem. Like the little awareness and interest at the end of the day that there is around climate issues. Thank you.
I wish I had a perfect answer to that, but I don't. But my simple answer is that, yes, we need to get the facts right, but the facts are not enough, especially if we want to meet a conservative audience, all the people that don't believe in climate change or that believe that climate change is not that important. We need to tell compelling stories. We need to admit that we are not rational human beings, but the best journalism are the best compelling stories when we feel that we are being moved, when we cry, when we laugh. But if you look at 95% of climate journalism, you don't laugh, you fall asleep. So that is the problem. We need to find the really good, compelling stories. And there are such stories. And climate, I really want to reward you for the job that you do. Climate literacy is extremely important, of course. Yeah.
Thank you. I think there was some question from the girls in the front row that I saw before.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I had a question, because you talked about the network or fund that you started a year ago and that it is global. And I'm just curious, to what extent do you also, when you're talking about sustainable journalism, but also climate journalism, to what extent do you also take into account climate justice? Because we do know that the countries that are poorer are the ones that are affected the most by climate change, and usually it is the more highly developed economies and countries that are actually producing most of the fossil fuel or whatnot. So I think climate justice is also equally important, because in countries where there's a lot of either political uncertainty or lack of more sustainable economic development, where media freedoms are also under pressure, it is more difficult maybe to implement such a model of sustainable journalism. So in those conversations that you have at this global fund, how do those different experiences come into play? So like the different political realities and the different realities within which media outlets exist, let's say if we talk about the global north, the global south or whatnot, and just climate justice in general, because I think when we're talking about climate change, there's a lot of, it's usually the most marginalized and the poorer people that get in poorer countries that are being the most affected. Is it also a responsibility of bigger Western international media outlets to pay more attention to also those types of stories? Because in a lot of those countries, they have less of an opportunity to make their voices be heard more.
And that is very true. Of course, I agree with everything. But I have found, I mean, I've met so much resistance during these 2 years. And we know that the fossil industry lobby, they have more resources than we have, to say the least. And they are and they are connected to the populist alt-right movement. And so we have a lot of resistance. When it comes to Sustainable Journalism Partnership, the majority of our members are from poor countries and also represented in the board that are mostly affected by climate change. But it is uphill. It is uphill. It's a fight we need to take. But so my strategy is very much not only talk about what is the right thing to do, because I think we all agree here what is the right thing to do. The rich countries, the rich media companies need to take more responsibility. That's a moral issue. But it's not only about that, because it's only about a business issue. So it's combining this, because I see that the old media companies, they are losing out on young audiences that are interested in this. They want to get more information. I take Danish Politiken as a very good example, understanding this and making business of it. So I think for us, the challenge is very much to see that connection between what is right to do, what is right to do morally, and connect that to a sustainable, profitable, or viable business model. That is our challenge.
Hi. I was just back from, just returned from central Greece when, where these villages, I don't know if you've seen, have flooded and many villages flooded and people had to be evacuated and their homes were destroyed. I was just back from there. I'm just back from there while we were filming a documentary about climate change and the effects of climate change, as using a case study of these floodings in central Greece. And many of the people I spoke to, the locals, that had lost their homes, that had seen their homes flooded, that were just coming back to take some of their belongings, were looking for homes elsewhere because they couldn't go back to their house and live anymore. When I mentioned and I was asking them about climate change and the effect of the, how do you feel about it? Most of them were like, no, this is not climate change. This is just lack of infrastructure, is corruption, is the funds that were available here in central Greece were diverted elsewhere. These things, well, we have extreme events every now and then. This is basically poor management of funds and poor infrastructure and bad material and not preparedness from the regional authorities. So, it was like I was just mentioning the climate change. So I was kind of adding this phrase and this term, and it wasn't something that was coming from them in a way that I was feeling like I'm kind of imposing this truth or this idea that we had, because we were doing this case study as the effects of climate change, increase of temperature. What happened in Greece this summer was not normal, actually. It was an extreme summer in terms of weather events. So what do you think? How would you react, or how would you respond to people who have been affected by flooding and by other these extreme events when they say, no, it's not climate change?
Well, there are two challenges here. One is the whole notion of climate change. It's a very complex matter. It's not fit for journalism. We like simple things. This is extremely complex. The other thing is that in many languages, there's not even a word for climate change. So how do you explain climate change to people that they don't even have a word for it? And the third thing is that if you look at survivors from climate change disasters, they are less willing to change and less willing to believe in climate change. So there's an opposite connection to you would think that now when you see all the floods and the hurricanes and so on, that people would understand this is climate change. But people that are actually affected react in the opposite way. So this is why climate journalism is so extremely difficult. And I think that the two most important changes in society today is climate change and artificial intelligence. Also for us as journalists, they are equally difficult to explain, and people are equally unwilling to accept that this is what's happening and that we have to relate to it. People want normality. They don't want artificial intelligence. They don't want climate change. People want to get on with their lives.
Thank you. I know there were other questions, but we're out of time, so maybe if there are some other questions, they can be answered outside, because there should be another panel here now. And thank you, everyone, for attending here. And thank you, Lars, for coming and giving this speech.
Thank you, Ronaldo. Thank you. Thank you.